One of Steam Deck's most popular games just got a big update announced. We'll talk about that, plus Valve's 2023 Steam annual summary. Phil Spencer has some more things to tell us about the future of Xbox, and the rumors were true. Before we get started, I want to say that a big thank you to everybody who subscribed on my last video. I normally don't ask people to subscribe, but when I asked, you guys clicked, and I really appreciate you. So thank you very much. All right, let's get started with Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. It just had its trailer drop. This is the DLC for the game that kind of put the Steam Deck on the map. They dropped it around the same time, and I'm convinced that the fact that Valve's handheld was able to run this game at a decent frame rate made a lot of people pay attention to the Steam Deck that otherwise wouldn't have. I was all in already, as I'm a huge fan of the Steam controller and Steam input, and everything that Valve was doing with the Steam Deck seemed like it was well thought out and the same decisions that I would make if I were making those decisions. But tons of people were skeptical of the Steam Deck. Was it going to be Steam machines all over again? Most people didn't really like the Steam controller, although I'm convinced that the people that didn't like the Steam controller didn't like it because they never gave it a chance. But seeing this super popular, brand new AAA game being played at acceptable frame rates on a handheld PC impressed a lot of people, and I don't think that the Steam Deck would be in as good a position as it is today without Valve stepping in and making sure that Elden Ring ran as well as it does on the Steam Deck. Anyway, that game is now getting DLC, and it looks really cool, though it certainly isn't for me. I played Elden Ring both on my Steam Deck and on my main PC, and I did enjoy the game. I enjoyed my time with it, but the level of frustration I had when fighting some of those bosses cemented that game and that genre really isn't my kind of game. But I'm really glad it's going to be getting updates for all of the people that love it. And now we'll see how people can find ways to beat bosses in new and creative ways, maybe with a harmonica being played with their feet or something. Valve dropped their 2023 year in review, though they don't call it that anymore. Now it's called the Steam annual summary, and there are things that I forgot that happened last year. It feels like last year was a bit of a blur, starting with Steam's new UI for big picture mode. I forgot that happened last year because basically I've been using that as my main UI for playing games since the deck came out. They also shipped new Steam VR updates for the MetaQuest and Valve's upcoming Deckard, although they certainly didn't mention that. Do you think it's coming out this year? Let me know in the comments down below. This pulled almost all of the features for Steam and Steam Deck into the new VR interface. They also updated integration with PlayStation controllers, which, as somebody with a DualSense Edge, I'm actually really happy about, because I love using the DualSense Edge on my computer, though I am waiting for Sony to release a dongle for the controller that'll let me use my DualSense features wirelessly instead of being wired into the computer via USB. Valve also talked about the Steam Deck specifically. They reminded us about the Steam Deck OLED as if we needed reminders, but then they even pointed out some of the competition in the handheld gaming, the PC handheld gaming category, specifically mentioning the ROG Ally, the One X Player, the One X Fly, as well as the Ion Neo Air. It's odd to me that they didn't mention the Lenovo Legion Go, but whatever. This is the kind of thing that you would never see other manufacturers do, because they don't win if somebody buys somebody else's hardware. But for Valve, it doesn't matter what system you buy as long as you're playing your games on Steam. This is why Valve's strategy is working so well. Real quick, I constantly get asked the question about which handhelds are my favorite, and as of right now, it's this. The Steam Deck OLED is number one easily. Everyone is miles and miles behind the OLED Steam Deck. The LCD Steam Deck comes in second place for me. The Legion Go in third place for me right now. The ROG Ally is still good, and I feel like Asus is doing a really good job updating Armory Crate. I just have trouble recommending it with the SD card issues that they had. Hopefully, they fix that in the upcoming sequel, although they did fix it in software by really ramping up the fans. The One X Player I never actually got to use, and then I did use the One X Fly, which I'm definitely not a fan of. It's small, which is nice, but the trade-offs that you get by going with that smaller form factor, they just aren't compelling enough to me. Back to Valve's year in review. They also mentioned that the Deck Verified program continues to improve and now has more than 12,000 games that are now playable or verified, although it's worth pointing out that the number of games that work just fine on the Steam Deck are well above 12,000. Most of those games just haven't been tested yet. And there are some games that are verified or playable, but I don't necessarily agree with those ratings. Phil Spencer had some things to say which contradict what his company is actually doing. He was talking to Stephen Totillo over at GameFile, and he said that the gaming market needs to find a way to grow. They see the same number of gaming consoles sold generation after generation, basically saying that the size of the gaming console user base is stagnant, and they need to find another way to grow the industry, meaning another way to grow their profits, a way to more aggressively monetize the people who are playing. Basically, this is why we're seeing that $70 price tag on more and more games becoming more common. But even that isn't going to be enough because the industry is focused so much on monetary growth. Eventually, you will hit a wall with that price, and then companies will have to resort to things that Phil Spencer says are manipulative, that I'm not a fan of. Someone might want to tell Spencer about the $65, I guess I'll call them macro transactions in Diablo 4, or the many times where games were supposed to come on day one to Game Pass, but only if you paid for early access. These things are what I call manipulative, and it's something that Microsoft is doing. Although in the case of Diablo's macro transactions, who's to say if Microsoft is going to allow Activision Blizzard to continue to do that? Of course, we have seen even more aggressive monetization models like loot boxes or microtransactions that are only available for a few hours, which triggers people's fear of missing out. So then they end up spending money on something that they probably would regret later. I just think that there's going to be some kind of reckoning when it comes to how these companies are monetizing us. And there's going to be a feedback loop that I think that they're not going to like. Although so far that hasn't happened. So maybe I'm wrong about that. Hey everybody, I'm in the middle of editing this video and I realized I never told you which rumors turned out to be true. So I'm breaking in the middle right now to tell you exactly what rumors I was talking about. The rumors were about the third-party games from Microsoft that were going to be coming to Nintendo Switch and a PlayStation. And it is now confirmed that it's going to be Hi-Fi Rush, Penitent, Grounded, and Sea of Thieves. No information on whether or not Hi-Fi Rush and Sea of Thieves will be coming to Nintendo Switch anytime soon. I'm probably thinking that it's going to be coming to the next Nintendo Switch whenever that actually comes out, although the rumors are that that's going to be next year. And a lot of people are probably wondering why is it that Microsoft didn't just make these announcements themselves when they had their, and I'm not going to call it a podcast because it was a super rehearsed, not a podcast. It was an announcement. It was a scripted announcement made to look like a podcast. But at their business update, why didn't they actually announce it right then? I'm guessing because they already had gotten into like some kind of deal with Nintendo that Nintendo was going to be the ones to do that during a Nintendo Direct. Imagine that none of this information had leaked ahead of time and you're just sitting there watching the Nintendo Direct and a bunch of Xbox games get announced as part of the Nintendo Direct. that would be a big announcement. And, Microsoft had agreed with Nintendo that they got to make that announcement. So for Microsoft to make that announcement ahead of time, a week ahead of when the Nintendo Direct is going to happen, that's kind of like going back on their deal. So I understand why they didn't make those announcements. But how many of you are going to end up picking up any of these 4 games on the other platforms? Let me know in the comment section down below that like button. Moving on, don't worry, I'm not going to spoil a nearly 30-year-old game, but that doesn't mean that the New York Times won't do that. First of all, as a guy who was born in the 70s and grew up in the 80s, the idea that the New York Times is posting video game news on the front page is baffling to me. Although I guess it shouldn't be, because games are huge, But to post a spoiler for a major story moment a week before that game comes out is just all kinds of dumb. Some people will say, "Oh, sorry for spoiling a 30-year-old game." And that's a semi-valid argument. Hell, I said that argument on the latest episode of the NerdNest podcast. Subscribe below. But when I said it, I also didn't actually spoil story stuff. I said names or locations. I was vague. The New York Times spoiled a shocking event in the game, and while it's almost 30 years old, there are tons of people who are playing Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth that never played the original. And the idea that they had that moment spoiled for them is really irritating, although maybe that moment won't come this time around. The fact that I saw people posting about it on social media, calling out the New York Times and saying that they were jerks for spoiling it, was great, except a lot of those people used screenshots of the New York Times website, which just further publishes the spoiler out there. I can't tell if these people are getting the irony. The skeptic in me thinks that the New York Times did this knowing that it would generate discussion, and that makes it even worse. Anyway, since we're talking about Final Fantasy VII Remake, I guess there is a new version of the demo which dropped today, and it's supposed to fix the graphical issues that people were complaining about with the demo, as well as give you access to more areas. I was going to skip it, but I guess by playing through the demo, you will get certain materia unlocked for your main playthrough, so I may end up downloading it anyway. I just finished Remake last week, and I am very hyped for Rebirth. I will say that the beginning of Remake, if it left a bad taste in your mouth like it did for me, give it another shot, but skip all of the side quests and just mainline the story stuff to get through it, because the later half of the game is really, really good. I had a blast with it. Speaking of later half, Sony recently stated that they were now in the later half of the PS5's life cycle, which a lot of people took issue with. But what I think is odd is the availability issues that Sony and Microsoft had with consoles at this generation has kind of skewed how people look at this generation. It feels like it just started for multiple reasons. Well, first of all, there was a longer than normal period of cross-generational games where we weren't really getting PS5 and Xbox Series games. We were getting games that would run on PS5 and Series X, but also would run on the Xbox One and the PS4. This coupled with the fact that most people couldn't get their hands on the new systems at launch because Sony and Microsoft, they just couldn't keep up with the demand. I think that those two things combined make this generation feel like it just started, when actually it's been going for 3 years now. The PS5 launched in November of 2020. If you look at the actual quote that Sony said, looking ahead, PS5 will enter the later stage of its life cycle. As such, we will put more emphasis on the balance between profitability and sales. For this reason, we expect the annual sales pace of PS5 will start falling from the next fiscal year. It isn't in the later half of its life cycle, it's entering the later half of its life cycle. So my guess is that we will see a PS5 Pro later on this year. There's been rumors about that, so I'm not like the only person talking about this. And then we'll have about 4 more years after that as the later half. That's a life cycle of 8 years for this generation, even though it doesn't feel like that long. But I will say that as they put more emphasis on the quote unquote balance between profitability and sales, I'm thinking that this will, how will this directly impact how aggressive Sony gets with bringing their games to PC this year, especially now that Helldivers 2 is climbing the charts over on Steam. By the way, I finally got to play for an extended period of time with Helldivers 2, and holy shit, this game is phenomenal. I'm finally understanding the gameplay loop and the stratagems that you get to use, and the game doesn't hold your hand, which I really like. If you haven't picked it up, pick it up. It's amazing. And you know what else is amazing? The people that watch this video right here from the Nerd Nest, I'm Bill. Stay rad, everybody.